And we're moving from a phase where, a transition plan or a climate goal is not just about aspiration, but, what is that roadmap to get to the desired endpoint? And that's what a good transition plan does. It sets out the aspiration, and then it says how we're going to get there. And that hard work has to obviously be operationalized as well.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past and present. Today's episode couldn't come at a better time. We are talking about directors' duties and climate transition planning. What is the role of today's company directors as businesses become more affected by climate-related risks and challenges? There's a lot of debate on greenwashing in particular, and we ask, what are the strategies that company directors can apply to address it? Joining me to share his insights is the head of policy at the Australian Institute of Company Directors, or AICD, Christian Gergis. Christian, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Michelle. Lovely to be here.
Let's start off with the AICD. I'm pretty sure that a lot of our listeners are familiar with what you do. You are the preeminent member organization for company directors, providing ongoing professional learning and development. But here we are talking specifically on climate transition. So when did you start looking at climate transition planning as an issue for company directors and also part of their directors' duties?
Thanks very much, Michelle. So I think if you remember that AICD is primarily a membership-based body focused on educating and upskilling the director community, and we have 53,000 members, everyone from the chair of Australia's largest listed entities through to the director of a small community not-for-profit, your local preschool, your local sporting association. Now, of course, the question of climate has been on boardroom agendas for a number of years, but I think an inflection point was probably reached 3 or 4 years ago where there was much greater focus. I think if you look at the journey of climate in Australian boardrooms, I think originally it was seen as an issue which was particularly significant to the big resource companies, energy companies, and now it's seen as a more mainstream issue, an issue of strategy and risk, and something which all boards should be thinking about. So the AICD in 2021 decided to become the host of the Climate Governance Initiative, the Australian chapter of that, which is a global collaboration under the World Economic Forum aimed at lifting the climate capability of directors in each jurisdiction. So we've collaborated with a number of partners around that. And in that time, we've produced a range of guidance. And the most recent is the one we're here to talk about today. We've also developed new educational courses focused on climate as well, which launched around a year ago and have had really strong uptake and been really impactful, I think. So in terms of transition planning, we've moved from a period, I think, in climate and discussions around the boardroom from climate being seen as a corporate social responsibility issue, as something that goes to reputation. And while that's still true in the sense that they are important considerations, much more focus now is seen as, how do we orientate our business to be successful for the next few decades, right? So not just seeing it of how can we be seen as not being damaging to the environment, but actually, the economy is changing. There is the biggest economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution in terms of the net zero transition. So there's got to be opportunities and risks that we need to manage sensibly. And the board obviously has a key leadership role. Over time, obviously, transition plans have been out there for a little while. They're becoming much more robust, much clearer. And the credibility of those plans is obviously being interrogated by investors, many of whom I'm sure are listening to this podcast, regulators and others. And we're moving from a phase where, a transition plan or a climate goal is not just about aspiration, but, what is that roadmap to get to the desired endpoint? And that's what a good transition plan does. It sets out the aspiration, and then it says how we're going to get there. And that hard work has to obviously be operationalized as well.
Well, we can all dream of net zero, but we need to learn how to get to net zero. You've talked about collaborations there and your latest guidance. I've got it in front of me, but it's called Governing for Net Zero, the Board's Role in Organizational Transition Planning. We'll leave a link on our show notes for those who want to have a look at that report. But this is a collaboration with the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, or ACSI. So why with ACSI and why now?
So, as I said, there's been a journey in terms of Australian boardrooms around how they have understood and engaged with the question of climate. And as I said, we've moved, I think, from a phase where organisations felt some kind of pressure to set out aspirational statements and weren't necessarily always having done all that homework before putting out those statements, to one where now we have organisations really recognising that if they put a statement out there, a goal, that there needs to be a plan to reach that. And obviously that's what a transition plan is meant to do. It's meant to provide a holistic picture to your shareholders, to your other stakeholders around, what your climate risk profile is like, what's that opportunity, and how you intend to get there. And obviously that's not just a target in the decades ahead, such as net zero by 2050, but a good transition plan has interim targets. A good transition plan has a board that is regularly checking in, making sure progress is on track. If it's not on track, what interventions are needed, what extra investment is needed. And so at AICD, when we were thinking about what more work can we do on climate, and as I said, we've got a number of free resources available on our website, we realised that transition planning was really the area of greatest need, because organisations realised they needed a holistic framework to present their approach to climate to the market, and also for internal purposes, right? That question of alignment, which I'm sure we'll get to as we discuss a little bit more in today's discussion, the transition plan really helps with that. And so ACSI seemed to us to be a natural partner. Obviously, ACSI is an important body in our market, provides guidance to institutional investors around their stewardship, and in particular, have played a leadership role around climate. And so what we wanted to do was to make sure that any guidance we gave to our members, to our director community, was informed by that investor perspective. Because ultimately, if you're a director of a listed company and you want to make sure that you maintain their support, then obviously you want to make sure that investor voice is coming through. And so hopefully this guidance will help support directors on how to oversee transition planning that can win that investor support.
And I like the fact that this is most definitely a long-term strategy. I know that the chief executive of ACSI, for example, Louise Davidson, said that super funds cannot easily diversify away from the impact of climate change. And this is something that is really over a protracted period of time. Now, you've given a couple of practical tips there or recommendations. One is the regular check-in, and second, and having those transition targets. But forgive me if I sound like, my goodness, we are going to talk about the G word again right now, aren't we? Greenwashing. But honestly, whenever we talk about greenwashing on FS sustainability, everyone leans in. This seems to be the thing where, like you've pointed out, there's a saying, my word is my bond. Now it's like, my word is not greenwashing. So tell us, what did you do in this report? I know that you have a case study there. What's in this guidance to help company boards address greenwashing?
Yeah, so this greenwashing issue is obviously a very complex one, and I think sometimes it's overly simplified. Essentially, though, from where I stand, greenwashing is about the say-do gap. So an organisation needs to make sure that what they say they're going to do, they actually do deliver on it. And some of the red flags I think for boards to look out for is unsupported statements, aspirational language, right? And while aspiration is important, is useful in lots of different domains of our life, if you're saying that the aim is to get to a certain point, then you need to have reasonable grounds for that kind of forward-looking statement. You need to be clear that you're going to have a plan that supports that goal being reached, and that plan is going to be prioritized effectively. There's going to be the resources allocated to it, whether that's human resources or whether that's financial resources. So I think in the past, some organizations had seen benefit in extolling their environmental credentials. And I think now what we're seeing is there's much more scrutiny around, all of these environmental statements that we're making, can we back them up? And that might be comments made in annual reports, there might be websites, might be advertising. And so I think boards are, leaning into these issues. Obviously, regulators are increasingly focused, and shareholders are too. And I think what's important to recognise, though, is, greenwashing can be intentional in the sense of someone trying to mislead the market, but it can also be unintentional. And I think we're now moving from a phase where you had various different, sometimes overlapping, sometimes inconsistent international reporting frameworks around climate. And now we have a global standard under the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has now been implemented locally. So that will allow, I think, the leaders and the laggards to be much clearer, right? To be able to identify them because you have a clear set of requirements that you need to comply with that standard. And so that means that greenwashing element will be, I think, harder to get away with going forward, which is a good thing.
Yes, I agree with you that there is a sense of, was this unintentional? Did we really articulate what we mean by being green or being sustainable? And now that ASIC definitely has its sights on greenwashing, it's just not something that people can turn away, let alone company directors. Now, I'm going to mention a phrase that you're probably familiar with. You probably use this every day, but best interest duties. So company directors understand what this means, but now we're talking about climate transition. So tell us about the director's best interest duty as it relates to the company's climate transition planning, for example.
So a few years ago, we were really thinking a lot internally about this question of directors' duties and how it intersects with questions around stakeholder perspectives, around the environment, around climate. And so we were consistently hearing feedback that there was confusion in the director community about the extent to which directors could think about these other factors, and indeed whether directors needed to take a short-term view or could take a longer-term view. So to provide some comfort for members, we commissioned two senior barristers, Brett Walker SC and Gerald Ung, to look at this question of the best interest duty. And what they concluded was that directors have considerable latitude to determine what is the best interest of their organisation. And when they're acting in the best interest of their organisation, they're acting in the interest of all of the organisation. They're not acting in the interest of one specific shareholder, for example. And so directors actually have a wide degree of latitude to take a long-term view. And what the AICD firmly believes is that to build long-term value, you need to think about your different stakeholders, right? Because those stakeholders can impact the viability of your business. They can impact how your strategy will be received, whether it will be successful or not. And so that's important. So bringing that to climate, obviously the question of directors' duty in climate, there's been a lot of debate around this and there's been various legal opinions. From our perspective, we think diligent directors should be thinking about climate change, working out, is this material to my business? How will we be impacted? And obviously mandatory climate reporting means that there's a much clearer approach and requirements. And then tying it back to transition planning, I think a board that has material climate risks, a transition plan can really support them to really nut out, what are our risks? How are we going to manage them? Over what time frames? And how do we explain that? And I think that accountability of having it written down, having it published, will mean that those plans will hopefully be followed through on, because obviously once you publish something, it's pretty natural that people check in and say, well, how are you going? And so that mandatory climate reporting will mean that there'll be annual disclosures. Now, the question of when a transition plan gets updated is an interesting one. Obviously, boards are thinking carefully about, when do they need to be updated? And if you're a listed company, then there may well be continuous disclosure obligations if there's a material change that could move the market. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a picture. It's not a straightforward answer, but I know a lot of boards are thinking about climate change through this question of best interest duty, and also their obligation of care and diligence. And with that latter obligation, what is expected of directors is increasing as understanding increases as well, and also as obviously some of those risks are starting to materialise.
And it is a serious issue where, as a director, whether you're executive or non-executive, that there is an expectation that you are fluent in the understanding of climate transition plans. And I know that in your guidance, we're only really just touching the tip of the iceberg, if you like. But anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about this new guidance?
I think one of the key learnings from the journey around climate governance and transition planning is that these plans can't be owned by one part of the business. It needs to be owned across the business. So while many on our call today will be from the sustainability team, obviously they have a key critical role coordinating across the business, but it needs to be a plan that is supported and not seen as something imposed upon different business areas. And this is where I think, a lot of discussions with our directors has brought out that the role of the CFO is critical. So if you're not already friends with your CFO and those in their team, then I suggest your listeners get in their ear and make sure they have their buy-in, because that's going to be the most important thing you can do in terms of making sure that the plan is actually developed, strong, and implemented effectively across the whole business.
Well, like I said earlier, this guidance is quite comprehensive. We will leave a link on our show notes about this. But that's all we have time for today. Christian, that was very insightful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.